It began with a silence so deep that even the men living inside couldn't hear it. A silence built not from peace, but from secrecy. It was stitched together by doctors in white coats who walked with quiet footsteps through the corridors of the early 20th century American South. They were planning a project that would change history in ways they never intended. And in the dark heart of this plan lay a truth so unsettling, it would take 40 years before the world finally understood what had been done. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment didn't erupt suddenly. It unfolded slowly, quietly, methodically, almost invisibly. It started in 1932, when the United States Public Health Service, in collaboration with the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, launched a study without telling its subjects its true purpose. To the African American men invited to join, it was presented as a program offering free medical checkups, meals, and burial insurance. This was a time when poverty hung over their communities like a constant storm. They were told they had bad blood, a vague and familiar term often used to describe multiple illnesses. The promise of help seemed like a rare chance in a world that usually ignored them. But behind the curtain, a plan had already been sketched out, a long-term observation of untreated syphilis in the human body. It was carried out not on volunteers who understood what was happening, but on unsuspecting men who believed they were finally receiving the care they had been denied for most of their lives. So we begin here with a hook buried in secrecy. How could a study that appeared so harmless hide something so ethically catastrophic? And how could an entire system let it continue for decades without stepping in? To understand why the experiment began, you have to walk through the landscape of the American South in the early 1930s. The Great Depression had carved deep wounds into every community, but it had struck African Americans with particular severity. It left them with limited access to resources, health care, or any structure that might support their well-being. Within this world, the Public Health Service saw an opportunity. They believed they could answer scientific questions about the long-term progression of syphilis, particularly in black men, whom they racially assumed would show its symptoms differently from white patients. This belief was rooted in the discriminatory ideas that many American institutions held at the time. The government itself wasn't ruled by a single individual shaping this plan. Instead, it was the product of a system where medical authorities operated with unchecked confidence. They were supported by a society that rarely questioned decisions made under the label of research. President Herbert Hoover occupied the White House when the project began, but the experiment would outlast multiple presidencies. It passed through Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson without interruption. It survived not because of active presidential support, but because it remained buried in the lower layers of bureaucracy where no alarms were raised. The surrounding conditions strengthened the facade. Medical care was scarce, the economy struggled, and the men recruited were sharecroppers, laborers, farmers, people accustomed to hardship, unfamiliar with medical jargon, and trusting toward institutions that claimed to help them. In such an environment, the purpose of the study could be twisted without anyone noticing. The question of why becomes clearer. It happened because the men running it believed they could do it without consequence. They believed that vulnerable communities would not resist, and that their actions would remain hidden under the quiet hum of rural life. As the experiment formally began in Macon County, Alabama, the researchers operated under the assurance that the men they recruited would never be told they had syphilis, nor would they ever receive treatment for it, even though treatments existed and improved dramatically as the years passed. At the start of the study in 1932, arsenic-based therapies were available, though imperfect. But the Public Health Service chose not to use them, arguing that the side effects were inconvenient for research purposes. Instead, they labeled the project a natural history study of syphilis, meaning their goal was to watch the disease unfold without interference. The deception deepened as time went on. The men were given placebos, aspirin, iron tonics, and vitamins, and were told these were helpful medicines. They were brought to clinics, given spinal taps disguised as special treatments, and visited by nurses who reassured them with warm smiles, creating a bond of trust that strengthened the illusion of care. When World War II erupted, many of the men registered for the draft, and during military medical examinations, their syphilis was detected. But the Public Health Service quietly intervened. They sent letters to military doctors requesting that the participants remain in the study without receiving penicillin. This detail is crucial. By the mid-1940s, penicillin had become the standard, effective cure for syphilis. It was widely available and publicly recognized as life-saving. Yet the study continued as if the cure did not exist. The question shifts from how did it begin to how did it continue? The answer rests in a mixture of professional pride, racial biases, and institutional silence. The researchers feared that treatment would invalidate the decades of observations they had already gathered. So they convinced themselves that the data was more valuable than the men's lives, a justification that allowed the experiment to proceed as if morality had been entirely removed from the equation. The conditions of the men during these early decades were shaped by the world around them. This was rural Alabama, where poverty was widespread, segregation was deeply institutionalized, and African American communities carried the weight of generations of inequality. This limited their opportunities for health care and education. Most participants worked long hours under the southern sun, earning barely enough to support their families. The promise of free medical attention, meager as it truly was, seemed like a lifeline in their otherwise harsh existence. They trusted the doctors because trust was all they had, and the doctors relied on that trust to keep the study intact. Families believed the government was watching over their loved ones. Churches encouraged participation, thinking it would bring help to the community. Local leaders, unaware of the deception, supported the project with hope rather than suspicion. In this environment, the experiment blended seamlessly into the rhythm of life, hidden behind a mask of benevolence. As we close this chapter, the stage is set for the decades-long tragedy that would follow. A tragedy not born from sudden violence, but from quiet neglect. A tragedy sustained not by anger, but by indifference. Part of what makes this story so haunting is the simplicity with which it was allowed to exist. No dramatic battles, no explosions, only paperwork, polite conversations, routine appointments, promises of help, and the silent suffering of men who believed they were finally receiving care. The real storm, however, had not yet arrived. The years ahead would test just how long a secret could remain buried before the truth finally tore it open. In the 1950s, a terrible secret was hiding in plain sight in Macon County, Alabama. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, a study that began decades earlier, was now a well-oiled machine, operating far from public view and ethical oversight. For the men involved, life continued with a veneer of normalcy. They faithfully attended their appointments, believing they were receiving treatment for bad blood. They trusted the doctors, followed instructions, and submitted to exams, completely unaware that each visit was just another step in a cruel, deceptive study. By this time, the world of medicine had found a miracle cure for syphilis, penicillin. It was the standard treatment, a proven way to stop the disease in its tracks. But for the men of Tuskegee, this cure was deliberately withheld. The U.S. Public Health Service, the very institution meant to protect public health, made a calculated decision. They argued that treating the men would ruin their data. They claimed that understanding the full, brutal progression of untreated syphilis in African American men was a scientific necessity, a goal that justified the deception. The web of lies grew more complex with each passing year. New participants were unknowingly recruited into the study. Their families were given false reassurances, told their loved ones were getting the best care possible. Official records were meticulously crafted to create an illusion of proper medical oversight, hiding the horrifying reality that men were being left to suffer and die from a treatable disease. The community, isolated and trusting, saw the white coats, the medical instruments, and the clinical rituals, and they believed in the narrative of healing. They had no reason to suspect that it was all a performance, a carefully constructed stage play designed to mislead, not to heal. All the while, the world outside this small Alabama community was racing forward. The Cold War was escalating. The first sparks of the civil rights movement were igniting, and medical and technological breakthroughs were changing the very fabric of American life. But in Macon County, time stood still for the men in the study. The experiment persisted, a silent, methodical shadow stretching long and dark over hundreds of lives, stealing their health, their futures, and their trust, one day at a time. The racial dynamics of the segregated South created the perfect environment for this unethical experiment to thrive. The participants were already marginalized, living in a society that denied them equal rights, economic opportunities, and social standing. Public health officials knew this and exploited it. They understood that these men had few, if any, other options for medical care. They had limited access to hospitals and had been conditioned by the social hierarchy to trust the authority of white doctors offering help. This power imbalance was the foundation upon which the entire study was built. To ensure the men kept coming back, researchers created a powerful illusion of care. They offered small but very real benefits: free rides to the clinics, hot meals on examination days, and basic treatments for minor ailments unrelated to syphilis. These gestures built a sense of loyalty and obligation, making the men feel valued and cared for, all while the disease silently ravaged their bodies. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. You might wonder, where were the ethical concerns? The shocking truth is that they weren't absent because people were ignorant. They were absent because the deep-seated, systemic racism of the era allowed it. The idea of experimenting on black men without their consent just didn't raise alarms in the way it should have. The system was designed to devalue their lives. Even the local media was oblivious, running occasional, feel-good stories about public health initiatives without ever digging into the dark reality of the study's true purpose. Within the federal government, the experiment was an open secret, buried in paperwork. Bureaucrats filed reports, passed memos, and used cold, clinical language like human experimentation with a chilling detachment. They treated the suffering of these men as mere data points, statistics that would one day contribute to scientific knowledge. The human cost was simply not part of the equation. In this way, the men of Tuskegee became living symbols of the profound social and medical inequalities of their time. Their bodies were the unwilling chronicles of a system that valued scientific knowledge far more than it valued human life. Throughout these years, the families of the participants remained almost completely unaware of the true nature of the study. They put their faith in the promises made by the doctors and officials, never suspecting the long-term consequences. Children grew up watching their fathers slowly weaken, their health mysteriously deteriorating. Wives and partners cared for their loved ones, struggling to understand the persistent illnesses. The community saw what looked like routine medical care and had no reason to be suspicious. The very language of medicine was weaponized. Doctors used technical terms, polite reassurances, and official-looking forms to give the project a veneer of legitimacy it never deserved. This air of professionalism masked a deep betrayal. The men continued to believe they were receiving the best care available, when in fact they were receiving no real treatment at all. The doctors and nurses involved were caught in a moral paradox. Many rationalized their participation, telling themselves they were contributing to science, advancing knowledge for the greater good. But in reality, they were active accomplices in a prolonged, monstrous deception that violated every principle of their profession. While the men in Tuskegee were trapped in this cycle of false hope and managed decline, the rest of the world was being transformed. New vaccines and antibiotics were eradicating diseases. The civil rights movement was challenging and dismantling segregation, and economic growth was lifting millions into prosperity. But within the invisible walls of the experiment, time was frozen. The men were stuck in an endless loop of observation and fake treatments. And the silence, from a government that should have protected them, and a medical community that should have saved them, allowed the experiment to burrow deeper, feeding both the ambitions of the researchers and the profound ignorance that let it all happen. By the late 1960s, the tide began to turn. The ground was shifting under the feet of the experiment's organizers. The civil rights movement had amplified the voices of the marginalized and put a national spotlight on racial injustice. A new generation of investigative journalists and concerned doctors was starting to ask tough questions about long-standing medical practices and the ethics of human experimentation. The Tuskegee study, once a footnote in obscure medical journals, was slowly moving toward the light. The men in the study were now much older. Decades of untreated syphilis had taken a devastating toll on their bodies. They were sicker, weaker, and while the full horrific truth was still hidden from them, many were beginning to feel a sense of disillusionment, a gnawing awareness that the free treatment they had been promised for so long had not made them better. Inside the Public Health Service, the once-unquestioned consensus began to fray. Internal discussions flared up. Should the study continue? But the inertia of a massive bureaucracy, combined with a defensive refusal to admit wrongdoing and a stubborn commitment to completing the dataset, meant that no decisive action was taken. The experiment staggered on, a relic of a bygone era of medicine. Meanwhile, American society was in turmoil. The country was grappling with a crisis of conscience over race, war, and authority. In response to other abuses, new federal regulations for research involving human subjects were starting to take shape. Medical ethics was evolving from a gentleman's agreement into a codified set of rules. In this crucible of change, the Tuskegee experiment stood out as a horrifying example of what happens when science operates without a soul, when racial prejudice is given institutional power, and when the pursuit of knowledge is seen as more valuable than human lives. The story of these decades isn't one of a single explosive event. It's a story of slow, quiet erosion. An erosion of trust, of health, and of morality. It's a story of a society that was willing to look the other way, to accept unspeakable harm, as long as it was wrapped in the comforting language of science and progress. The stage was now set for the final act, a confrontation, a revelation, and a painful public reckoning that would finally drag this 40-year-long secret out of the shadows and into the harsh light of day. As the 1970s dawned, the shadow that had hung over Macon County, Alabama, for 4 long decades finally began to shift. A quiet, methodical experiment, which had operated under the guise of free medical care, started to unravel in ways that could no longer be contained. It was a story that had been hidden in plain sight, a secret kept by bureaucracy and silence. But secrets like this don't stay buried forever. Investigative journalists, civil rights advocates, and brave medical whistleblowers started piecing together the horrifying truth. They found fragments of the story in forgotten files, in hushed conversations, and in the quiet suffering of the men themselves. The picture that emerged was so shocking it challenged the very foundations of American public health ethics. For 40 years, hundreds of African American men in rural Alabama had been told they were being treated for bad blood. In reality, they were subjects in a study on the long-term effects of untreated syphilis. They were never given penicillin, the known cure, even after it became widely available in the 1940s. The men who had participated, many of them now old and frail, were finally confronted with the devastating reality. They had been deceived for their entire adult lives. Their pain, their blindness, their failing health, it had all been observed and recorded for the sake of data. The cure that could have saved them, it could have prevented decades of suffering, had been intentionally withheld. When the story broke, public outrage was swift and immense. Government officials scrambled to contain the scandal, but the evidence was undeniable. The voices of the men, their families, and their communities, so long ignored, were now impossible to silence. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, once cloaked in the quiet language of research and institutional authority, was exposed to the world. It became a powerful symbol of systemic failure, a terrifying cautionary tale of what happens when science is divorced from morality, and when deep-seated social prejudice intersects with institutional power. The long, quiet deception had ended, and in its place, an eruption of awareness began, forcing a nation to look at the human consequences of choices made behind closed doors. The aftermath of this exposure was a complex and heartbreaking mix of sorrow, anger, and deep reflection. All across Macon County, families began to learn the truth. They discovered that their fathers, husbands, and grandfathers had been denied life-saving treatment. They realized that lives had been cut short, that health had been deliberately compromised, and that the impact of these decisions would ripple through generations. The men themselves faced not only the devastating physical consequences of untreated syphilis, the heart problems, the neurological damage, the blindness, but also the immense psychological burden of betrayal. The very institutions that were supposed to protect them, the doctors and nurses they had trusted, had instead exploited them in the most profound way. This betrayal sent shockwaves across the entire country. Civil rights leaders and medical professionals began a fierce and public debate over the ethical implications. How could an experiment like this have been allowed to happen? How could it have continued unchecked for 40 years in modern America? The answers were uncomfortable, pointing to a deep-seated racism that devalued black lives and a scientific culture that had lost its moral compass. In response to this national crisis, a revolution in medical ethics began. New protocols for human research were proposed, debated, and eventually written into law. This is where concepts we take for granted today were born. Institutional Review Boards, or IRBs, were created to oversee and approve any research involving human subjects. The principle of informed consent, the idea that every participant must fully understand the risks and benefits of a study before agreeing to join, was enshrined as a non-negotiable standard. Federal oversight was strengthened to ensure that no experiment could ever again operate in such secrecy and with such disregard for human life. These reforms, born directly from the ashes of the Tuskegee scandal, forever transformed the landscape of medical research. But even as these vital new policies were put in place, the human cost remained. No law, no reform could ever undo the decades of lost health, broken trust, and the profound grief of families left to grapple with the consequences. The official end of the experiment came in 1972. It wasn't a quiet administrative decision. It was a firestorm. A whistleblower named Peter Buxton, who had worked for the Public Health Service, finally disclosed the full story to the press. His courage ignited a wave of media attention and public outrage that the government could no longer ignore. In November of that year, the United States Public Health Service announced that the study would end immediately. Finally, after 40 years, the surviving participants were offered treatment. But for so many, the damage was already done. It was irreversible. The government faced intense scrutiny at the highest levels. There were congressional hearings, lawsuits, and public inquiries, all demanding accountability. Officials were forced to publicly confront the moral failings that had allowed this to happen for decades. The survivors and their families, represented by civil rights attorney Fred Gray, filed a class action lawsuit. They were eventually compensated through a federal settlement, but everyone knew that no amount of money could truly address the betrayal. It couldn't bring back the years of suffering or the lives that were lost. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment became more than just a story of a single medical failure. It became a powerful and enduring symbol of the systemic racism that had enabled it in the first place. It held up a mirror to the nation, reflecting the deep-seated disparities and prejudices embedded in American society. The scandal highlighted the absolute importance of transparency, oversight, and unwavering ethical vigilance in all medical research. Its legacy continues to shape public policy, healthcare practices, and our collective memory to this day, a constant reminder of the human cost of injustice. Looking at the broader context, the end of the experiment reveals a society that was just beginning to reckon with its own contradictions. The civil rights movement had been fighting for years against segregation and discrimination, and this scandal laid bare the ugliest truths of that fight. For African American communities, who had long been subjected to limited and often hostile healthcare systems, Tuskegee was a horrifying confirmation of their deepest fears, that in the eyes of the establishment, their suffering was something to be observed, not alleviated. For the medical establishment itself, the scandal was a moment of profound soul-searching. It sparked urgent debates about trust, ethics, and the fundamental responsibilities of those entrusted with human life. Doctors and scientists were forced to ask themselves, where is the line between the pursuit of knowledge and moral responsibility? Across the nation, everyday citizens began to question this balance, realizing that progress measured in data and scientific findings can never outweigh the value of a single human life. The public awareness that erupted from this story created ripple effects that went far beyond Macon County. It influenced education, changing how ethics are taught in medical schools. It influenced public policy, leading to the protections we have today. And it influenced the broader fight for civil rights, becoming another powerful piece of evidence in the case against systemic inequality. By the time the final documents were signed and the last participants received the care they should have gotten decades earlier, the story of Tuskegee had become a profound lesson in humanity justice and the devastating consequences of placing ambition above ethics. The stage was now set for historical reflection and memorialization, as the echoes of this story continue to resonate across time, reminding us of a history we must never forget and never repeat. By the 1950s, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was a deeply entrenched system, a machine that ran silently, hidden from public view and ethical oversight. Its reality was a secret kept within the walls of clinics in Macon County, Alabama. The men, trusting souls, kept their appointments for what they believed were treatments. They submitted to exams and followed instructions, never knowing that each visit was just another step in the study's cruel design. During these years, medical science had made incredible leaps forward. Penicillin was now known across the globe as the definitive cure for syphilis. Yet the U.S. Public Health Service made a conscious choice not to intervene. Their rationale was cold and calculating. Treating the men would ruin decades of data. They argued that understanding the full, untreated progression of syphilis in African American men was a scientific necessity. This justification became the bedrock of their deception. As the study expanded, so did the layers of deceit. New participants were recruited with the same false promises. Families were reassured that their loved ones were getting top-notch care. Official records were meticulously crafted to project an image of medical oversight, a facade that concealed the chilling truth. These men were being denied life-saving medicine. The local community, meanwhile, continued to place their faith in the doctors. They saw the white coats, the instruments, and the procedures, and they saw care. They couldn't know it was all part of a narrative designed not to heal, but to mislead. And while this was happening, the world outside was changing at a dizzying pace. The Cold War had begun, the civil rights movement was starting to simmer, and America was making huge strides in medicine and technology. Yet, in this small corner of Alabama, the experiment persisted. It moved forward quietly, methodically, casting a long, dark shadow over the lives of every person it touched. The racial dynamics of the South during these decades made everything worse. Segregation laws and deep-seated social norms had already pushed these communities to the margins. both economically and socially. Public health officials knew this and exploited it. They understood that these men had few, if any, other options for medical care. They had limited access to hospitals and had been conditioned to not question the authority of white doctors offering help. To keep the men compliant, researchers provided small but tangible incentives. They offered free rides to the clinics, hot meals, and minor treatments for other unrelated ailments. These small kindnesses built a sense of loyalty and ensured the men would keep coming back, all while the disease silently ravaged their bodies. Ethical concerns weren't just ignored, they were non-existent. The systemic racism of the era provided a kind of permission structure, allowing these actions to continue without any real challenge. The local media was also oblivious, occasionally running stories about public health initiatives, but never digging into the dark reality of this particular study. Inside the federal system, the experiment was just paperwork. Bureaucrats filed reports and passed memos using detached, clinical language like human experimentation. They discussed these men's lives as if they were just statistics, data points that could justify the quiet suffering of human beings. In this way, the men of Tuskegee became unwilling chroniclers of the deep social and medical inequalities that defined their time. They were living proof of a system that valued knowledge far more than it valued human life. Throughout these years, the families of the participants remained almost entirely in the dark. They held on to the promises made to them, completely unaware of the devastating long-term consequences unfolding before their eyes. Children grew up watching their father's health slowly decline. Wives and partners cared for their loved ones as they struggled with mysterious ailments. The community saw what they thought were routine medical procedures and had no reason to be suspicious. The very language of medicine was weaponized. Technical jargon, polite reassurances, and official-looking forms gave the entire project a veneer of legitimacy it never deserved. The men continued to believe they were receiving the best care possible. The doctors and nurses involved in the study found ways to rationalize their roles. They told themselves they were contributing to science, advancing human knowledge. But the truth is, they were complicit in a prolonged, monstrous deception that violated every known ethical standard. While time seemed to stand still in Tuskegee, the world outside was in constant motion. New vaccines and antibiotics were saving millions. The civil rights movement was fighting for and winning crucial advancements. Economic growth was transforming society. But within the invisible walls of this experiment, the men remained trapped in a horrifying loop of observation and fake treatment. And the silence from those who should have been providing oversight allowed the study to deepen its roots, feeding the researchers' ambitions and the public's ignorance. But by the late 1960s, things started to change. The experiment, so long hidden in rural Alabama, began to attract unwanted attention. The civil rights movement had empowered people to question authority. Investigative journalists were more willing to dig for uncomfortable truths. And a new generation of doctors began to seriously question the ethics of human experimentation. The men in the study were now decades older. They were sicker, and while they still didn't know the full truth, they were becoming more aware of the severe limitations of the care they had been receiving for so long. Even within the public health service, uneasy conversations began to take place. Should the experiment finally be stopped? But a combination of bureaucratic inertia, defensiveness, and a stubborn desire to see the data through to the end meant that no action was taken. This was happening against the backdrop of a radically transforming America. Racial tensions were at a boiling point. A new field of medical ethics was emerging, and the federal government was finally starting to create oversight for research practices, largely in response to other discovered abuses. In this crucible of change, the Tuskegee study stood as a relic of a bygone era, but also as a terrifying warning. It showed what happens when science operates without accountability, when racial prejudice is combined with institutional power, and when the pursuit of knowledge is deemed more important than human lives. The story of these decades isn't one of big, explosive events. It's a story of slow, quiet erosion. It's about trust being systematically exploited. It is about a society that was willing to look the other way when harm was dressed up in the language of progress. The stage was now set for a confrontation, for a revelation, and for the final, painful reckoning that would bring this long-hidden, shameful truth into the light. The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.